Jessica Morden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you very much for allowing me to have this debate today, which I understand may well be the first parliamentary debate on e-scooters in this place. I understand from friends in the other place that there have been a number of references down there, but I believe this might well be the first parliamentary debate on e-scooters. Now, the rise of the e-scooter has been a worldwide phenomenon. The global market for the product has been valued at more than 15 billion a year, and one that has made its mark in the UK over recent years. It's estimated there are now 750,000 private e-scooters in use in the UK, the majority being used illegally, with the Bicycle Association suggesting that as many as 360,000 were purchased in 2020 alone. And we can expect further growth in the use and sales here in the UK over the years to come. So today I speak to draw attention to an issue which is a cause of much frustration to my constituents, the antisocial and the illegal use of e-scooters. Whilst not necessarily isolated to individual areas, I know that Liswerry, Ringland, Alway and St Julian's in my constituency have been flashpoints for this activity, and my thanks to the councillors, to the residents and even a scout group who have discussed this with me, with groups of e-scooter and e-bike riders careering between pavements and the road, breaking speed limits, which I've witnessed myself, running red lights, weaving in and out of traffic and causing other vehicles and pedestrians to take avoiding action. As one constituent put it to me, the culprits are usually clothed in black without any reflective items and have total disregard for the highway code and pedestrians. In the dark winter months, this is obviously even more of a hazard for other road users. Ahead of this debate, I've received a lot of feedback from constituents sharing their experiences of e-scooters, and I wanted to quote just a few examples. One constituent says they are dangerous, they're on the pavements, and as someone who has a mobility problem, I have a problem getting out of their way quick enough. I'm worried I'll get knocked down. Another resident said they weave in and out of traffic and scare me to death as they just suddenly appear. And another said, as someone who is hard of hearing and with no directional hearing, I don't hear them, and they're a menace when ridden on pavements. Local residents feel intimidated, unsafe and annoyed, not least because the use of e-scooters on roads, pavements and cycle lanes is illegal everywhere in Wales, and there are no designated Welsh e-scooter trial areas. Speaking as a Welsh MP, I do note that there is some crossover with devolved policy making. For example, any move to extend the existing UK government trials to Wales would depend on working with the Welsh Government and with Welsh councils and would require the Senedd to amend traffic signs regulations. However, it's important to point out that road traffic offences, driver licensing, vehicle insurance and vehicle registration are all reserved issues for the UK Government to address. E-scooters are rightly classed as motor vehicles when they're legally used in trial areas, which means the same rules that apply to motor vehicles also apply to e-scooters, including the need to have licence, insurance and tax. At the moment, you can't get insurance for privately owned e-scooters, and as such, you wouldn't be eligible to make an accident or injury claim if you were involved in an incident while riding unlawfully on public roads. The Association of British Insurers have highlighted that if uninsured e-scooter users cause collisions or injury, the Motor Insurers Bureau must pick up the liability for these claims. And the MIB report that they're already seeing a growing number of claims from the illegal use of e-scooters, and there's potential to incur significant costs, which ultimately may lead to increases in motor insurance premiums for other motorists, which is a really unfair situation. In short, unless they're on private land, no one in Wales should be using an e-scooter, nor should anyone in the rest of the UK unless they're renting an approved e-scooter in one of the 30 designated trial areas. To add to some of the confusion that exists around the law as it stands, several of these trial areas are just over the other side of the Severn Bridge from my constituency in Bristol, Gloucester, Cheltenham and Bath. Gwent Police, I know, are doing what they can to crack down on this and have had success in seizing a number of e-scooters engaged in antisocial and illegal activity around Newport. And this includes e-scooters and indeed e-bikes, e-motorcycles being used in drug dealing, which is an alarming trend both locally and across the UK. Now, we know that the police can't be everywhere, though, and resources are still stretched after 12 years of Tory cuts. And let's not forget in Gwent that Gwent Police saw its budget cut by 40% in the last decade, and it's only been able to maintain a high level of service by increasing the precept. And from speaking to the police and other stakeholders, there's a real sense that the problem isn't a lack of provision for enforcement action, but rather a widespread and dangerous lack of knowledge about what the law is, particularly amongst young people. The waters have been muddied further by leading retailers, and The Guardian reported on this week that last week Amazon were advertising a new e-scooter model as a commuter companion. The promotion warned users not to travel on the scooter during thunderstorms, but failed to point out that its use on any British road would be illegal. Retailers need to behave more responsibly. This is something Road Safety Wales and Gwent Police have campaigned on previously, and I totally agree with them that retailers should do more to ensure that potential customers are fully aware that illegal e-scooter use carries with it the risk of a £300 fine, 6 penalty points on their driving licence, and the potential seizure of the scooter. The Home Office and the Department of Transport do need to do more around awareness too. It shouldn't be left to individual police forces whose resources are already stretched to educate the public. That's one of the main challenges I would put to ministers today. What are they doing to ensure that everyone living outside of a designated trial area knows they shouldn't be using an e-scooter on the road, on a cycle path or on the pavement? The use of e-scooters on pavements is also a particular concern for those with hearing loss and the visually impaired who rely on clear, safe routes in order to travel independently. Research carried out on behalf of guide dogs earlier this year showed that 78% of people with sight loss had had a negative experience with an e-scooter, and over 50% had reported change in their behaviour due to e-scooters, including not going into some parts of town, changing their regular routes, and doing what they can to reduce the risk of encountering e-scooters. Guide dogs also report that 12% of people with sight loss have had their mobility aid or cane hit by a scooter, 10% have been hit but not injured, and 2% have been hit and injured by one. The virtually silent nature of e-scooters is undoubtedly a contributing factor here. Guide dogs and the RNIB are supportive of the introduction of an e-scooter equivalent to the acoustic vehicle alert system on quiet, hybrid and electric vehicles. This week, BBC News reported how Salford University are developing new technologies that might help with this, working closely with the RNIB and the micromobility company DOT. I trust the government will be monitoring this closely and continuing to consider options for sound-related regulation of e-scooters in the future. Sound isn't the only problem, though. Private e-scooters are currently unregulated. There are no restrictions on their power, their weight or their speed. Indeed, the maximum speed for private e-scooters far exceeds the capped limit for trial e-scooters. Many privately purchased e-scooters are capable of travelling at 30 miles per hour. Some models, such as one of the models highlighted as a cause for concern by guide dogs, which is currently sold out on the manufacturer's UK website, can reach speeds as high as 68 miles an hour. And a report by Margaret Winchcombe of the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety notes that even those private scooters capped at 30 miles an hour can be modified to reach speeds of 60 miles an hour. Even the rental e-scooters used in the trial areas have a maximum power that is double that of e-bikes and a maximum weight of 55 kilograms. That's roughly 3 times the average weight of a standard e-bike. The speed, weight and power requirements for e-scooters in trial areas in the UK is also much more lenient than those in place in equivalent schemes in other European countries. And the combined effect of higher e-scooter speed, power and weights in the UK means that these vehicles are significantly more dangerous in a collision. It's little wonder then that there's been a marked increase in the number of crashes involving e-scooters. There were 460 reported collisions in 2020. DFT figures covering the year from June 2021 to June 2022 show that this had risen to 1,349, and over the last year alone the number of people seriously injured in a collision has risen to 429 with 12 deaths. There are issues for the government to look at now. There's a real need to improve awareness around the existing laws amongst the public. Gwent Police and other forces have taken a lead.
Order. I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn to resume her speech. Jessica Morden.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Gwent Police and other forces have taken a lead with social media campaigns, particularly around Christmas, making the public aware of the rules for e-scooters before they're purchased as Christmas presents. But there seems to be little national steer from either the Home Office or the DFT on educating the general population. I also want to ask what the government's doing to ensure that our police forces have all the resources they need to tackle antisocial e-scooter use. When I raised this with the former Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Witham, in September, she told me that colleagues in the Department for Transport were liaising with the College of Policing and the National Police Council on this issue, and it would be really interesting to know if there are any updates on that and if a joined up approach to enforcement action across the UK is going on. And on a related note, it's also worth asking what steps will be taken to ensure that efficient mechanisms are in place to report e-scooters which are being used dangerously or illegally. RNIB Cymru are just one of the organisations that have highlighted this as a nationwide issue. And on e-scooter specifications, a response that I got to a written question recently that I tabled to the Department for Transport stated that the government was currently considering options for construction and use regulations for e-scooters, which will likely include requirements for details such as power, weight and maximum design speed. And I understand the Minister might not today to be able to provide a comprehensive answer to that on the specification regulation, but any updates on the time frame when we can expect an announcement or a consultation would be welcome. I think the lack of regulation and control over the sale of untested and potentially unsafe privately owned e-scooters is a real problem. As my Right Honourable friend, the member for Exeter, highlighted at the Transport Select Committee this week, the UK is falling years behind other countries in terms of its lack of regulation on e-scooters, as well as issues such as pavement parking. There's also an ongoing issue with transparency and data reporting from the trial areas in England, something that needs to be addressed quickly, given that the government has already announced that the trials can be extended until May 2024. After all, these trials are just that, they're tests. At the moment, it's hard to work out what metric the government is using to decide whether the trials have been successful or not, and it would be wrong for ministers to press ahead towards legislation across the UK on the basis of scarce evidence from selected areas in England. As just one example of that, in its 2020 report on e-scooters, the Transport Select Committee called on the government to clarify how it would monitor whether rental trial e-scooters were being ridden on pavements, including how many users were being penalised for this event, and if ministers had evaluated and identified effective measures to eliminate such antisocial behaviour. Despite saying it agreed with the Select Committee recommendation at the time, there's been no meaningful update on how these issues are being monitored and whether the trials are in fact working. It's also worth pointing out that several major European cities which initially embraced different forms of e-scooter trials, notably Paris, Stockholm and Copenhagen, have since partially reversed course and introduced more stringent regulation on their use. E-scooter schemes in Europe are generally far better regulated than the English trials too. For example, in Germany, all e-scooter users need to be insured, display insurance stickers, use appropriate lights, brakes, reflectors and bells. And in countries like France, Austria, Belgium, Finland, Portugal, rules of the road for e-scooter users replicate those in place for cyclists. When I spoke about some of the antisocial behaviour we've seen in Newport East, I also made reference to e-bikes, which in the light of many of my constituents are part of the same problem. Many complaints relate to what appear to be electric bikes, but are technically electric motorcycles, as mechanically propelled vehicles with no pedals. It's possible to purchase legal electric bikes, but over the past 2 years, Gwent Police have only come across one in our region. Instead, the vast majority being used in residential areas are not able to be used legally on the roads without licence, tax and insurance and MOT, and as a result they can be seized under Section 165 of the Road Traffic Act. And the police can deal with the rider in relation to any offences found. Gwent Police have had some success in seizing offending vehicles over recent months, but enforcement comes with its challenges. For example, local residents have reported it's difficult to build up an intel picture of those engaged in dangerous driving or criminal activity, given the culprits often wear similar dark clothing, face coverings and use bikes which look incredibly similar. All factors which make it much harder for the police to identify the offenders, let alone justify high-speed pursuits. Again, there are issues here for the government to look at. I appreciate there are other sides to this debate too, and there will, of course, be advocates for e-scooters, certainly as we want to shift from car use. One constituent said to me, I do agree they provide a very cheap, a convenient form of transport, and as usual, it's the inconsiderate riders who spoil it for the genuine ones. And another said, I think e-scooters and e-bikes are great modes of transport, and with zero emissions, they're a step in the right direction. However, the way they're used at the moment is dangerous, and there should be clear rules regarding whether they're for road use or not, and make the users have proper lights and wear reflective clothing. What is clear is that we're seeing a modal shift away from cars, a shift we need to see, and I accept there's a legitimate case for e-scooters forming part of that mix in the future. But before pushing ahead with the expansion of the legal use of e-scooters, the government should be aware of the strength of feeling that exists in communities like the one I represent, a view that's shared by residents, shaped really by residents' experiences of e-scooters as a nuisance, closely linked to antisocial behaviour. Their stance and that of charities like Guide Dogs and RNIB, who represent the concerns of some of the most vulnerable people in our community, is that the government should not proceed with the legislation of privately owned e-scooters based on limited evidence available from the designated rental areas alone. Instead, the government should look at strengthening regulation and put public safety first in all the decisions they make. Earlier this year, the former Transport Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Welwyn Hatfield, said that the government planned to introduce measures concerning e-scooters in the Queen's speech. These measures never came. A wider transport bill was also promised, but we learned this week from the new Transport Secretary that it's unlikely to see the light of day in this Parliament. That sheds further light on the recent response to written question from my honourable friend, the member for Warwick and Leamington, on e-scooter regulation, where the Minister stated the government would legislate on micro-mobility when parliamentary time allows. The Transport Secretary at least acknowledged this week that the merry-go-round of ministers in the department have contributed to legislative gridlock. Whichever way you look at it, it's not good enough. So I'd be really grateful if the Minister could, in his response, provide a more substantive update on the overdue transport bill today, as well as any necessary secondary legislation to introduce regulations on electric scooters as a defined form of micro-mobility. Finally, in its 2020 inquiry, the Transport Select Committee said the government should be developing and implementing a sensible and proportionate regulatory framework for legal e-scooter use, drawing on lessons from other countries which ensure that the potential negative impacts on pedestrians and disabled people are avoided. That's still something that hasn't happened and which needs to happen now. Thank you.